Section 3 of the Critique of Practical Reason by Immanuel Kant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Fiore. The Critique of Practical Reason by Immanuel Kant, translated by Thomas Kingsmill Abbott. Section 3. First Part. Elements of Pure Practical Reason. Book 1. The Analytic of Pure Practical Reason. Chapter 1. Of the Principles of Pure Practical Reason. Theorem 3. A rational being cannot regard his maxims as practical universal laws, unless he conceives them as principles which determine the will, not by their matter, but by their form only. By the matter of a practical principle I mean the object of the will. This object is either the determining ground of the will, or it is not. In the former case the rule of the will is subjected to an empirical condition, viz., the relation of the determining idea to the feeling of pleasure and pain. Consequently it cannot be a practical law. Now when we abstract from a law all matter, i.e., every object of the will, as a determining principle, nothing is left but the mere form of a universal legislation. Therefore, either a rational being cannot conceive his subjective practical principles, that is, his maxims, as being at the same time universal laws, or he must suppose that their mere form, by which they are fitted for universal legislation, is alone what makes them practical laws. Remark. The commonest understanding can distinguish, without instruction, what form of maxim is adapted for universal legislation, and what is not. Suppose, for example, that I have made it my maxim to increase my fortune by every safe means. Now I have a deposit in my hands, the owner of which is dead and has left no writing about it. This is just the case for my maxim. I desire then to know whether the maxim can also hold good as a universal practical law. I apply it, therefore, to the present case, and ask whether it could take the form of a law, and consequently whether I can, by my maxim, at the same time, give such a law as this, that everyone may deny a deposit of which no one can produce a proof. I at once become aware that such a principle, viewed as a law, would annihilate itself, because the result would be that there would be no deposits. A practical law, which I recognize as such, must be qualified for universal legislation. This is an identical proposition, and therefore self-evident. Now if I say that my will is subject to a practical law, I cannot adduce my inclination, e.g., in the present case my avarice, as a principle of determination fitted to be a universal practical law, for this is so far from being fitted from a universal legislation that, if put in the form of a universal law, it would destroy itself. It is therefore surprising that intelligent men could have thought of calling the desire of happiness a universal practical law on the ground that the desire is universal, and therefore also the maxim by which everyone makes this desire determine his will. For whereas in other cases a universal law of nature makes everything harmonious, here, on the contrary, if we attribute to the maxim the universality of a law, the extreme opposite of harmony will follow, the greatest opposition and the complete destruction of the maxim itself and its purpose. For in that case the will of all has not one and the same object, but everyone has his own, his private welfare, which may accidentally accord with the purposes of others which are equally selfish. But it is far from sufficing for a law, because the occasional exceptions which one is permitted to make are endless, and cannot be definitely embraced in one universal rule. In this manner, then, results a harmony like that which a certain satirical poem depicts as existing between a married couple bent on going to ruin. O marvelous harmony! What he wishes, she wishes also. Or like what is said of the pledge of Francis I to the Emperor Charles V, What my brother Charles wishes, that I wish also. Viz. Milan. Empirical principles of determination are not fit for any universal external legislation, but just as little for internal, for each man makes his own subject the foundation of his inclination, and in the same subject sometimes one inclination, sometimes another, has the preponderance. To discover a law which would govern them all under this condition, namely, bringing them all into harmony, is quite impossible. 5. Problem 1. Supposing that the mere legislative form of maxims is alone the sufficient determining principle of a will, to find the nature of the will which can be determined by it alone. Since the bare form of the law can only be conceived by reason, and is, therefore, not an object of the senses, and consequently does not belong to the class of phenomena, it follows that the idea of it, which determines the will, is distinct from all the principles that determine events in nature according to the law of causality, because in their case the determining principles must themselves be phenomena. Now if no other determining principle can serve as a law for the will except that universal legislative form, such a will must be conceived as quite independent of the natural law of phenomena in their mutual relation, namely, the law of causality. Such independence is called freedom in the strictest, that is, in the transcendental sense. Consequently, a will which can have its law in nothing but the mere legislative form of the maxim is a free will. 6. Problem 2. Supposing that a will is free to find the law which alone is competent to determine it necessarily. Since the matter of the practical law, i.e., an object of the maxim, can never be given otherwise than empirically, and the free will is independent on empirical conditions, that is, conditions belonging to the world of sense, and yet is determinable, consequently, a free will must find its principle of determination in the law, and yet independently of the matter of the law. But besides the matter of the law, nothing is contained in it except the legislative form. It is the legislative form, then, contained in the maxim, which can alone constitute a principle of determination of the free will. Remark. Thus freedom and an unconditional practical law reciprocally imply each other. Now I do not ask here whether they are in fact distinct, or whether an unconditioned law is not merely the consciousness of a pure practical reason and the latter identical with the positive concept of freedom. I only ask, whence begins our knowledge of the unconditionally practical, whether it is from freedom or from the practical law? Now it cannot begin from freedom, for of this we cannot be immediately conscious, since the first concept of it is negative, nor can we infer it from experience, for experience gives us the knowledge only of the law of phenomena, and hence of the mechanism of nature, the direct opposite of freedom. It is therefore the moral law of which we become directly conscious, as soon as we trace for ourselves maxims of the will, that first presents itself to us, and leads directly to the concept of freedom, inasmuch as reason presents it as a principle of determination, not to be outweighed by any sensible conditions, nay, wholly independent of them. But how is the consciousness of that moral law possible? We can become conscious of pure practical laws just as we are conscious of pure theoretical principles, by attending to the necessity with which reason prescribes them, and to the elimination of all empirical conditions, which it directs. The concept of a pure will arises out of the former, as that of a pure understanding arises out of the latter. That this is the true subordination of our concepts, and that it is morality that first discovers to us the notion of freedom, hence that it is a practical reason which, with this concept, first proposes to speculative reason the most insoluble problem, thereby placing it in the greatest perplexity, is evident from the following consideration. Since nothing in phenomena can be explained by the concept of freedom, but the mechanism of nature must constitute the only clue, moreover, When pure reason tries to ascend in the